The letter arrived without warning, and it changed everything before Alina hardly even finished reading the first line. "Marry the Duke of Ashcombe," her father said, his hands shaking as he held the paper toward the candlelight. "He has asked for you by name." Alina stood frozen in the small parlor of their London townhouse, the fire crackling weakly behind her, the smell of unpaid bills and cold tea hanging in the air. Her father's shipping business had failed 3 months earlier. Since then, every room in the house had grown a little colder, every meal a little smaller, every conversation a little more desperate. "Why would a duke want me?" she asked. "He has never even spoken to me." Her father did not answer at first. He only handed her the letter, his eyes avoiding hers, and Alina understood before she read a single word that this was not a romance. This was a transaction. The letter was short. It came not from the Duke himself, but from his solicitor, written in careful, distant language. Duke Sebastian Ashcombe of Ravensmoor Hall wished to propose a marriage. The Hartley family's debts would be settled in full. A generous allowance would be provided for Alina's parents for the remainder of their lives. In exchange, Alina would become Duchess of Ashcombe. There was one condition, stated plainly without apology. The future Duchess must be quiet. She must never embarrass the family in public. She must never draw attention to herself at social events. She must, in the solicitor's exact words, learn to disappear gracefully into her role. Alina read the line 3 times. "He wants a wife who says nothing," she said quietly. "A wife who is barely there at all." "Alina," her father said, his voice breaking, "if you refuse this, we lose the house. We lose everything. Your mother's health cannot survive another winter in the cold." Alina looked at her mother, sitting near the fire with a blanket over her knees, her face pale and thin. She looked at her father, a proud man reduced to begging his daughter for a solution he could not provide himself. She looked around the room at the furniture they had already begun selling, piece by piece, just to keep food on the table. She was 22 years old, and she had always imagined that if she ever married, it would be for something real. Affection, respect, a partnership built on more than silence and money. But the girl who had once dreamed of such things had grown up watching her family fall apart, and dreams, she had learned, did not pay debts. "I will meet him," she said finally. "Before I agree to anything, I want to meet the man who wishes to buy my silence." The meeting was arranged within the week, at a formal drawing room in the Ashcombe London residence, a house so grand and so cold that Alina felt smaller with every step she took toward it. A footman led her through hallways lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her, judging her before she had even spoken a word. Duke Sebastian Ashcombe was waiting for her in a room with tall windows and very little warmth. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 30, with dark hair and an expression that gave nothing away. He did not smile when she entered. He did not rise with any particular enthusiasm. He simply studied her, the way a man might study a piece of furniture he was considering for purchase. "Miss Hartley," he said, "thank you for coming." "Your Grace," she curtsied, though something in her resisted the gesture. "I imagine you have read the terms." "I have." "Then you understand what is required." Alina lifted her chin. "You want a wife who is silent, who does not embarrass you, who disappears into the background of her own life." Something flickered across his face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "I want a wife who understands the importance of discretion. My family has certain expectations, certain standards. I am not asking for cruelty, Miss Hartley. I am asking for peace." "Peace for whom?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the window and looked out over the London street below, his hands clasped behind his back. "My mother, the Dowager Duchess, places great importance on the reputation of this family. There have been difficulties in the past. Difficulties I do not wish to repeat." "What difficulties?" "That is not a conversation for today." Alina studied him carefully. There was something guarded in the way he spoke, something that suggested his request was not simply about pride or propriety. There was fear beneath his words, though he clearly did not wish her to see it. "And if I agree," she said, "what happens to me? Do I simply vanish into this house? Do I stop existing the moment I put on your ring?" "You will be treated with respect. You will want for nothing. You will simply be asked to remain quiet in public settings, to avoid drawing attention, to let the family's reputation remain undisturbed." "That sounds like a life in a cage, Your Grace." He turned to look at her then, and for the first time, something like surprise crossed his features. Perhaps no one had ever spoken to him so directly. Perhaps the women he had considered before her had simply agreed without argument, grateful for the security his title offered. "It is the arrangement I am prepared to offer," he said. "You may accept it or you may decline. I will not pretend it is anything other than what it is." Elinor thought of her mother's thin face, her father's trembling hands, the cold rooms of a home that would soon no longer be theirs. She thought of the years ahead and the choice before her, a life of poverty and uncertainty or a life of comfort bought with her silence. She thought, too, of the flicker of fear she had seen in his eyes when he mentioned his mother, the mention of difficulties he refused to explain. There was a story behind this house, behind this family, behind this strange and cold proposal, and some quiet, stubborn part of her wanted to know what it was. "I will marry you," she said, "but I want you to understand something, Your Grace. I can be discreet, I can be careful, but I do not know if I can be silent forever. I do not know if any woman can." He studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded, as though her words meant less to him than they should have. "We shall see, Miss Hartley." The wedding was arranged within a month, small and swift, as though the family wished to complete the transaction before anyone could ask too many questions. Elinor signed the documents that secured her family's future, and in return, she became the property of a house full of secrets she had not yet begun to understand. On the morning of her wedding, as she stood in front of a mirror in an unfamiliar room, wearing a gown chosen by someone else, for a ceremony planned by someone else, Elinor thought of the promise she had made to herself the night before. She would honor her word, she would be careful, she would protect her family's future with her cooperation. But she would not disappear. Whatever waited for her at Ravensmoor Hall, whatever secrets the Ashcombe family guarded so tightly, whatever silence they demanded of her, Elinor Hartley intended to find out the truth behind it. And no amount of cold hallways, stern portraits, or careful instructions would stop her from doing so. As the carriage pulled away from her childhood home for the last time, she pressed her hand against the cold glass of the window and watched the only life she had ever known disappear behind her. Ahead lay Ravensmoor Hall, a house of rules and silence, and a husband who had made his demands clear from the very first meeting. Elinor did not know yet what waited for her there. She did not know about the letters hidden in locked drawers, the portrait of a young woman no one spoke of, or the truth her new husband had spent years trying to bury. She only knew that the quiet life she had agreed to was about to become far louder than anyone in that family could have imagined. The carriage rolled to a stop in front of Ravensmoor Hall just as the last light of evening faded from the sky, and Elinor's first impression of her new home was one of quiet dread. The building rose before her like a fortress, gray stone stretching upward into the darkening clouds, its windows lit from within by a scattering of candles that did little to soften its cold, imposing face. Rows of tall hedges lined the drive, cut with such precision that they looked almost unnatural, as though nothing in this place was permitted to grow freely. Sebastian helped her from the carriage without a word, his hand brief and formal against hers. A line of servants stood waiting at the entrance, silent and still, their eyes fixed forward as though they had been trained not to look directly at their new mistress. At the top of the steps stood a woman Elinor recognized immediately as the Dowager Duchess, Sebastian's mother. She was tall, sharp-featured, dressed entirely in dark colors despite the season, and she studied Elinor with an expression that held no warmth at all. "So this is her," the Dowager Duchess said, as though Elinor were not standing directly in front of her. "The merchant's daughter." "Mother," Sebastian said, a note of warning in his voice. I am simply stating a fact, Sebastian. There is no need for such delicacy. The Duchess turned her gaze fully on Alina. I trust you understand what is expected of you here. I have been told, Your Grace, Alina said, keeping her voice steady despite the chill in the older woman's eyes. Being told and understanding are two very different things, my dear. We shall see which one applies to you. With that, the Dowager Duchess turned and walked back into the house, leaving Alina standing at the base of the steps with the growing sense that she had just entered a battle she did not fully understand the rules of. The interior of Ravensmoor Hall was as cold as its exterior suggested. Long hallways stretched in every direction, lined with portraits of Ashcombe ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to track Alina's every movement. The furniture was old and heavy, arranged with such careful precision that it seemed less like a home and more like a museum preserved for the benefit of visitors who never came. A housekeeper named Mrs. Whitfield led Alina to her chambers, a large but sparsely decorated room on the second floor, connected by a locked door to what Alina assumed were Sebastian's own quarters. The housekeeper was polite but distant, offering only the information necessary and nothing more. Dinner is served promptly at 7, Mrs. Whitfield said. Her Grace, the Dowager Duchess, expects punctuality and silence unless spoken to directly. Is that a house rule, Alina asked, or simply good manners? Mrs. Whitfield's expression flickered, something like sympathy crossing her tired features before she composed herself again. It is simply how things are done here, my lady. It has been this way for a long time. That first dinner set the tone for what was to come. The dining room was vast, the table long enough to seat 20, though only 3 places had been set. Sebastian sat at the head of the table, his mother to his right, and Alina was placed at the far end, close enough to hear the conversation but positioned in a way that made clear she was not expected to contribute to it. The Dowager Duchess spoke at length about matters of the estate, about upcoming social obligations, about the importance of maintaining the family's standing among their peers. Sebastian responded when necessary, brief and measured, never offering more than the conversation required. Alina said nothing throughout the entire meal, testing the silence they had asked of her, watching the way mother and son interacted with careful, practiced distance. There was tension between them, something unspoken that ran beneath every polite exchange, though Alina could not yet identify its source. It was only as the servants cleared the final course that the Dowager Duchess turned her attention to Alina directly for the first time all evening. You have said very little tonight, she observed. I was told silence was expected, Your Grace. Silence is expected in public, in society, at gatherings where the family's reputation is at stake. Within these walls you may speak when you have something worth saying. The Duchess's eyes narrowed slightly. Do you have something worth saying, Miss Hartley? Or should I say Duchess Hartley now? Alina considered her words carefully before speaking. I noticed there are very few portraits of women in this house. For a family with such a long history, I would expect more. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sebastian's jaw tightened, and the Dowager Duchess's expression grew as cold as the stone walls around them. There are portraits enough, the Duchess said sharply. You have simply not looked in the right places. Perhaps you could show me sometime. Perhaps I could not. The Duchess rose from the table, signaling the end of dinner. You would do well, Duchess Hartley, to remember that curiosity is not always a welcome trait in this household. Some questions are better left unasked. She swept from the room without another word, leaving Alina alone with Sebastian for the first time since their arrival. The silence between them stretched long and uncomfortable before he finally spoke. You should not provoke her, he said quietly. I asked a simple question. There are no simple questions in this house, Alina. It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the way he said it, tired and almost apologetic, softened the sharpness of his warning. My mother has her reasons for the rules she keeps. I would ask that you respect them for now. For now, Alina repeated. That implies there is a reason things might change. Sebastian did not answer. He simply stood, offered her a brief, formal bow, and left the room, leaving Alina alone at the long table with nothing but her own thoughts and the watchful eyes of the ancestors painted on the walls around her. Over the following days, Alina began to learn the rhythms of Ravensmoor Hall, the careful choreography of a household built entirely around avoiding attention. Meals were quiet. Conversations were brief. The staff moved through the halls with practiced silence, speaking only when necessary, avoiding eye contact whenever possible. She noticed, too, the small signs of unease that ran beneath the surface of the household. A young maid named Alice flinched whenever the Dowager Duchess raised her voice, even slightly. An older footman named George kept his eyes fixed on the floor whenever the Duchess passed, as though making himself as invisible as possible was a skill he had spent years perfecting. Alina began to understand that the silence demanded of her was not unique. It was simply the newest expression of a rule that had governed this house for a very long time, one that touched everyone who lived within its walls, servant and family member alike. It was during a quiet afternoon, while exploring the east wing of the house on her own, that Alina found the locked door. It was tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway, unlike the other doors in the house, which stood open or at least unlocked. This one was bolted shut, the wood around the lock slightly worn, as though it had been opened and closed many times over the years despite its official state of closure. "That room is not to be entered." Alina turned to find Mrs. Whitfield standing behind her, her expression unusually tense. "Whose room was it?" Alina asked. "It belonged to Lady Charlotte," Mrs. Whitfield said, her voice dropping to something close to a whisper. "The Duke's sister." "I did not know he had a sister." "He does not speak of her. No one in this house does." Mrs. Whitfield glanced nervously down the hallway as though worried someone might overhear. "It would be best, my lady, if you did not ask about her either." "Why not?" Mrs. Whitfield hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to the family and something else, something that looked almost like guilt. "Some things are better left buried, my lady. For everyone's sake." She turned and walked away before Alina could ask anything further, leaving her alone once again in the narrow hallway, staring at the locked door that hid whatever secret the Ashcombe family had spent years trying to keep silent. That night, as Alina lay awake in her cold, unfamiliar bedroom, she thought of the portrait Sebastian's mother had refused to discuss, the locked door at the end of the hallway, the flinching maid, the footman who could not meet anyone's eyes. She thought of Sebastian's warning, delivered not with cruelty but with something that sounded almost like fear. Whatever had happened to Lady Charlotte, whatever secret this family guarded so carefully behind locked doors and demands for silence, Alina was now a part of this house. And she was beginning to understand that the silence they wanted from her was not simply about propriety or reputation. It was about protecting something or someone. And Alina Hartley had never been very good at leaving locked doors unopened. She rose from her bed and walked to the window, looking out over the dark grounds of Ravensmoor Hall, the moon casting long shadows across the perfectly trimmed hedges below. Somewhere in this house, a truth was waiting to be found, hidden behind years of careful silence and practiced fear. Alina did not know yet how she would find it, but she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her chest, that she would not stop looking until she did. 3 weeks into her marriage, Alina found the letters. It happened by accident, or at least she told herself it was an accident, though some part of her had been searching for exactly this kind of discovery since the night Mrs. Whitfield had warned her away from the locked door in the east wing. She had been looking for a book in the library, a room Sebastian rarely used and the staff seemed to avoid, when she noticed a loose panel behind one of the lower shelves. Curiosity, the very trait the Dowager Duchess had warned her against, pulled her hand forward before her mind could talk her out of it. Behind the panel was a small wooden box, its lock broken, its lid slightly ajar as though someone had opened it in haste and never quite closed it again. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, tied together with faded ribbon, the paper yellowed with age. Alina recognized the handwriting immediately as feminine, delicate but firm, and the name signed at the bottom of each letter confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. Charlotte. She sat on the library floor, her back against the shelf, and began to read. The letters were addressed to a friend, someone named Margaret, and they painted a picture of a young woman slowly being suffocated by the very walls that now surrounded Alina. Charlotte wrote of a mother who demanded perfect silence at every gathering, who punished any hint of independent thought with cold withdrawal and public humiliation. She wrote of a father, long since passed, who had built the family's reputation on the appearance of perfect, obedient women, and a mother determined to preserve that legacy no matter the cost. One letter, dated only months before the final entry in the collection, struck Alina with particular force. "I am so tired, Margaret, tired of being told when I may speak and when I must remain silent, tired of smiling at gatherings while feeling as though I am disappearing a little more each day. Sebastian tries to help me, but he is as trapped as I am, perhaps more so, for he will one day inherit this house and everything it demands of the women within it. I fear for what will happen to whoever he marries. I fear sometimes for what will happen to me." Alina's hands trembled as she set the letter down. The final letter in the collection was shorter than the others, the handwriting less steady, as though written in haste or under great distress. "I cannot bear this any longer. I have decided to leave, Margaret, with or without my family's blessing. I know what they will say. I know what will be done to protect the family's reputation once I am gone, but I would rather be forgotten than remain silent forever. I will write again once I am somewhere safe." There was no further letter after that one. Alina sat in the silent library for a long time, the letters spread across her lap, piecing together the story the Ashcombe family had worked so hard to bury. Charlotte had tried to leave. Charlotte had wanted freedom from the silence her family demanded. And Charlotte, as far as Alina could tell from the sudden end of the correspondence, had never gotten the chance to write again. She needed to know what had happened. Her opportunity came a few days later, during one of the rare moments when the Dowager Duchess was away from the house, visiting a sick relative in the countryside. Alina found Sebastian alone in his study, poring over estate documents with the same guarded, distant expression he wore almost constantly. "Tell me about Charlotte," she said, closing the door behind her. Sebastian's pen stopped mid-stroke. For a long moment he did not look up. "Where did you hear that name?" "I found her letters. In the library." His head snapped up, something close to alarm flashing across his face before he composed himself again. "Those should not exist. My mother had everything of hers removed years ago." "Not everything, apparently." Alina stepped closer to his desk. "She wrote about being suffocated by this family, Sebastian, by your mother's rules, by the silence she was forced to keep. She wrote that she planned to leave, and then the letters simply stop." Sebastian set down his pen very carefully, as though the smallest movement might shatter something fragile inside him. "She did leave," he said quietly, 6 years ago. And she died 3 months later, in a small village 2 counties away, living under a false name, working as a seamstress to support herself. She caught a fever. There was no one there who knew who she truly was, no one to send word to her family until it was already too late. The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Alina felt something twist painfully in her chest, grief for a woman she had never met, anger at a family that had driven her to such desperate circumstances. "Your mother knows this," Alina said slowly, "and still she enforces the same silence that drove your sister away. My mother believes Charlotte's death was a tragedy caused by her own recklessness. She believes if Charlotte had simply followed the rules, accepted her place, she would still be alive today. My mother has never once considered that the rules themselves might be the cause." "And you? What do you believe?" Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance, somewhere far beyond the walls of his study. "I believe I failed my sister," he said finally. I was the only one who might have helped her, and I was too afraid of my mother's anger to do anything but watch her suffer. When she asked me to help her leave, I hesitated. By the time I agreed, she had already gone. I never had the chance to make things right. Elinor understood, suddenly, the source of Sebastian's cold demeanor, his insistence on silence, his careful, guarded distance from the world around him. It was not cruelty that drove his request for a quiet wife. It was fear born from guilt, from the belief that silence and obedience might have saved his sister's life, when in truth, it may have been the very thing that killed her. "Sebastian," she said gently, "your sister did not die because she spoke too loudly. She died because no one was there to help her when she needed it most. Silence did not protect her. It isolated her. You cannot know that. I know that a woman running from a life of forced silence, alone in a strange village with no one to turn to, is a woman who had nowhere safe to go. If your family had simply allowed her a voice, allowed her some measure of freedom within these walls, perhaps she would never have needed to run at all." Sebastian said nothing, but Elinor could see the words settling into him, cracking something that had been sealed shut for a very long time. "I am not asking you to defy your mother," Elinor continued. "I am asking you to consider that the silence you demand of me, the silence this family has always demanded of its women, is not protection. It is a cage, and I do not intend to die inside it the way your sister did. That is not fair. It is not meant to be fair. It is meant to be true." Sebastian rose from his desk and walked to the window, much as he had during their very first meeting, his hands clasped behind his back, his shoulders tense with a weight Elinor was only now beginning to understand. "My mother will never allow this house to change," he said quietly. "She has spent her entire life building its reputation on obedience and discretion. She will not tolerate anything that threatens that legacy." "Then perhaps," Elinor said, "it is time someone challenged her." Sebastian turned to look at her, and for the first time since she had arrived at Ravensmoor Hall, Elinor saw something other than distance in his eyes. She saw the faint, uncertain flicker of hope, buried beneath years of guilt and fear, struggling to find its way back to the surface. "You would risk everything," he said. "My mother's anger, the family's reputation, perhaps even the safety this marriage was meant to provide your own family." "I would risk it," Elinor said, "because I refuse to become another silent portrait in this house, forgotten and unspoken, the way your sister has become. I refuse to let the same silence that took her life take mine as well." The study fell quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. It no longer felt like a cage closing around her. It felt like the pause before a decision, the breath before a step forward into something neither of them could yet fully see. Elinor did not know exactly what she intended to do with what she had learned, not yet. But she knew that the letters hidden behind the library shelf, the story of a young woman silenced until it destroyed her, had changed something fundamental in the way she understood her marriage, her new home, and the fight that lay ahead of her. The Ashcombe family had built its reputation on silence. Elinor intended to be the one who finally broke it. The invitation arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, addressed to Lord and Lady Pembroke, old friends of the Ashcombe family, who had been invited to dine at Ravensmoor Hall to discuss a matter of business between the two estates. Elinor read the guest list with a growing sense of unease, sensing that this dinner would not be like the quiet, careful meals she had grown used to. She was right. Lord Pembroke arrived with his wife and his younger cousin, a sharp-tongued man named Edmund Carow, whose reputation for cruelty disguised as wit had followed him through every social circle in London. Elinor had heard whispers of him before, a man who delighted in exposing weakness, who collected the embarrassments of others the way some men collected fine art. The dinner began pleasantly enough, the conversation circling around matters of business and estate management, topics Elinor had no interest in and no permission to comment upon. She sat quietly at the far end of the table, exactly as she had been taught, watching the careful performance of politeness unfold around her. It was Edmund who broke the pattern. "Tell me, Duchess," he said, his eyes glinting with something predatory as he turned his attention toward Alina for the first time all evening. "Is it true your father's shipping business collapsed under the weight of his own poor decisions? I heard he lost an entire fleet to bad investments." The table fell silent. Alina felt the weight of every eye turning toward her, including Sebastian's, though his expression remained carefully neutral, offering her no help, no defense, nothing at all. "My father's business faced difficulties," Alina said carefully. "As many businesses have, in uncertain times." "Difficulties?" Edmund smiled, clearly enjoying himself. "That is a generous word for what I heard. I heard he gambled away half his fortune before the business even failed. I heard your family was one missed payment away from the workhouse before this marriage rescued you." He turned to Sebastian with a mocking grin. "Quite the charitable arrangement, your grace, buying yourself a wife from the gutter." The Dowager Duchess said nothing, her expression carefully composed, though Alina thought she detected the faintest hint of satisfaction in the older woman's eyes, as though this humiliation was simply confirming what she had believed about Alina from the very beginning. Alina waited for Sebastian to speak, to defend her, to say anything at all in response to the cruelty being directed at her family. He did not. He simply sat, silent and still, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on his plate, exactly as the rules of this house demanded. Something inside Alina, something that had been quietly building since the moment she read Charlotte's final desperate letter, finally broke free. "My father built a successful business from nothing," she said, her voice calm but carrying clearly across the silent table. "He lost that business not through recklessness, but through circumstances beyond his control, the same circumstances that have ruined far greater men than him in far greater houses than this one. I am not ashamed of where I come from, Mr. Caro. I am proud of it. My family worked for everything they had. They did not inherit it, as you did, without ever having to prove they deserved it." Edmund's smile faltered, replaced by something colder. "How dare you speak to me in such a manner?" "I dare," Alina said, "because I am tired of sitting silently while people who have never worked a day in their lives insult those who have worked every day of theirs. I dare because silence in this house has already cost enough." "Alina," Sebastian said quietly, a warning in his voice, though whether it was meant to protect her or protect the family's reputation, Alina could not tell. "No," Alina said, turning to face him directly. "I have been quiet since the day I arrived in this house. I have watched servants flinch at raised voices. I have read letters from a woman who was silenced until it destroyed her. I have sat through dinner after dinner, biting back every thought, every opinion, every piece of myself, because I was told that was the price of security for my family. But I will not sit silently while a guest in this house insults my family's honor simply because we did not inherit our wealth." The Dowager Duchess's composure finally cracked. "You forget yourself, Duchess Hartley." "I remember myself perfectly, your grace," Alina said, rising from her seat. "Perhaps for the first time since I arrived here." The dinner ended shortly after, in a stiff and uncomfortable silence, Lord and Lady Pembroke making hurried excuses to leave, Edmund Caro departing with a final, cold glare directed at Alina, as though she had personally wronged him simply by refusing to remain silent. Once the guests had gone, the Dowager Duchess turned on Alina with a fury Alina had not yet seen from her. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" the Duchess hissed. "Lord Pembroke is a valuable business connection. You have humiliated this family in front of him." "I did not humiliate this family," Alina said. "Your guest humiliated my family, and I refused to remain silent while he did so. There is a difference, your grace, though I understand it may not be one you are accustomed to seeing. You will apologize to Lord Pembroke. You will write to him personally and express your regret for your behavior tonight." "I will not." The Duchess turned to Sebastian, clearly expecting him to intervene, to command his wife into obedience the way the rules of this house had always demanded. But Sebastian remained silent, his eyes moving between his mother and his wife, something conflicted, and uncertain playing across his face. "Sebastian," the Duchess said sharply, "control your wife." "She is not a horse to be controlled, mother," Sebastian said quietly, and Alina felt something shift in the room, a small but significant crack in the foundation of silence this family had built its entire existence upon. The Dowager Duchess stared at her son as though he had struck her. "You would take her side. After everything I have done to protect this family's reputation, after everything that happened with your sister." "Charlotte died because she had no one to turn to," Sebastian said, his voice rising for the first time since Alina had known him. "She died because this house demanded her silence until she had nothing left to give. I will not watch the same thing happen to my wife." The room fell into a heavy, charged silence. The Dowager Duchess's face had gone pale, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, though whether from anger or something closer to grief, Alina could not tell. "You know nothing of what happened to your sister," the Duchess said finally, her voice quieter now though no less sharp. "I know she wrote letters describing exactly the kind of suffocation Alina has described tonight. I know she died alone, under a false name, because she had nowhere else to turn. And I know that you have spent 6 years insisting her death was her own fault, when perhaps, mother, it was ours." The Dowager Duchess said nothing further. She simply turned and left the room, her steps echoing sharply against the stone floor, leaving Alina and Sebastian alone in the aftermath of a confrontation that had been building for years, long before Alina had ever arrived at Ravensmoor Hall. "Thank you," Alina said quietly, once his mother's footsteps had faded into silence. "Do not thank me," Sebastian said. "I should have said something the moment Caro began speaking. I should have defended you immediately. Instead, I sat silent, exactly as this house has always taught me to do. You spoke eventually, that matters. It should not have taken this long." Alina stepped closer to him, studying the tired, conflicted expression on his face. "Your mother built this house on the belief that silence protects a family's reputation. Tonight, you began to question that belief out loud in front of her. That is not nothing, Sebastian. That is the beginning of something." "The beginning of what?" Alina thought of Charlotte's letters, of the locked door at the end of the East Wing hallway, of the flinching servants, and the careful, practiced silence that had governed this house for far too long. "The beginning of change," she said, "whether your mother is ready for it or not." Sebastian did not respond, but he did not look away from her either, and for the first time since her arrival at Ravensmoor Hall, Alina felt as though she was no longer standing entirely alone within these cold, silent walls. The days following the disastrous dinner passed in a strange, tense quiet, the Dowager Duchess retreating into her private chambers for hours at a time, emerging only for brief, cold appearances at meals before withdrawing again. Sebastian moved through the house like a man carrying a weight he had finally allowed himself to acknowledge, though he had not yet decided what to do with it. Alina used the silence to think. She thought of Charlotte, of the letters hidden behind the library shelf, of a young woman driven from her home by rules designed to keep her small, unseen, and ultimately unsafe. She thought of the flinching servants, the locked door at the end of the East Wing, the years of careful, practiced silence this family had wrapped around itself like armor. And she thought of the reception. It had been mentioned only briefly, weeks earlier, during one of the Dowager Duchess's long recitations of upcoming social obligations. The Ashcombe family, as tradition demanded, was expected to host the grand reception marking the formal opening of the London social season, an event so significant that every notable family in the city would attend. It was an honor the family had quietly declined for the past 6 years, ever since Charlotte's death, the Duchess claiming the household was still in a period of appropriate mourning, though Alina suspected the truth was closer to fear than grief. Alina found Sebastian in his study late one evening, the candles burned low, his papers forgotten on the desk in front of him. "I want to host the season's reception," she said without preamble. Sebastian looked up, clearly startled. "That is not possible. My mother has refused that honor for 6 years." I am aware. I would like to change that. Eleanor, you do not understand what you are asking. That reception will draw the attention of every family in London. Every rumor, every question, every piece of gossip that has ever circulated about this house will resurface the moment we open our doors to society again. Good, Eleanor said. I am tired of secrets hiding behind locked doors and careful silence. If the truth about Charlotte is going to come out eventually, and I believe it will, I would rather it come out on our terms, in our own house, surrounded by people who might finally understand why the rules of this family need to change. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. You wish to use the reception to expose my family's secrets. I wish to use the reception to stop hiding from them, Eleanor said. There is a difference, though I understand it may look similar from where you are standing. My mother will never agree to this. Then perhaps it is time she is given no choice. Sebastian rose from his desk and walked to the window, a habit Eleanor had come to recognize as his way of gathering his thoughts before speaking something difficult. You understand what you are proposing. A reception hosted by this family after 6 years of silence will not simply be a quiet gathering of old friends. It will be a spectacle. Every eye in London will be watching for a misstep, waiting for scandal. Then let them watch, Eleanor said. Let them see a family willing to finally speak honestly about its past, rather than one hiding behind locked doors and careful silence. Let them see a household that has chosen honesty over reputation, even when it is difficult. And if it destroys us, if my mother's fears about the family standing prove correct. Eleanor stepped closer to him. Sebastian, your family's standing has already been built on a foundation of silence that took your sister's life. I do not believe that foundation is one worth protecting any longer. I would rather risk the family's reputation than continue living inside the same silence that destroyed Charlotte. Something shifted in Sebastian's expression, the careful guard he had maintained since the moment Eleanor arrived at Ravensmoor Hall, finally beginning to crack under the weight of her words. You truly believe this could change things? Not just for us, but for this entire house. I believe silence has never protected anyone in this family. I believe it is time someone tested that belief, openly, in front of everyone who has ever whispered about what happens behind these walls. Sebastian nodded slowly, though the uncertainty had not fully left his eyes. I will speak with my mother. The conversation between Sebastian and the Dowager Duchess took place behind closed doors, and Eleanor was not present to witness it, though she heard the raised voices carrying faintly through the halls, an unusual occurrence in a house that had spent years perfecting the art of silent disagreement. When Sebastian emerged, his face was pale but resolute. She has agreed, he said, reluctantly, under the condition that everything proceeds according to the family's usual standards of propriety. I can work within that condition, Eleanor said, though privately, she already knew that the reception she intended to host would look nothing like the quiet, careful gatherings the Ashcombe family was accustomed to. Over the following days, Eleanor began planning in earnest, though she kept the full scope of her intentions carefully hidden from the Dowager Duchess, who had made it clear she expected a small, dignified affair, consistent with the family's usual restraint. Eleanor had other plans. She began first with the household staff. She sought out Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper who had first warned her away from the locked door in the east wing, and found the older woman in the kitchen, overseeing preparations for the evening meal. I would like your help, Eleanor said, with something rather unusual. Mrs. Whitfield's expression grew cautious. What sort of help, my lady? I intend to host the largest, most memorable reception this family has held in years. I would like the household to help me plan it, truly plan it, with input from everyone who has spent years working within these walls. I do not want a quiet, forgettable gathering. I want something that finally allows this house to breathe. Mrs. Whitfield studied her for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. The Dowager Duchess will not approve of such an undertaking. The Dowager Duchess has agreed to allow the reception. She has simply not been informed of every detail yet. A faint, cautious smile touched the corners of Mrs. Whitfield's mouth, the first genuine expression of warmth Alina had seen from her since arriving at Ravensmore Hall. "I believe, my lady, that I would very much like to help with something like that." Word spread quietly among the staff over the following days, and Alina found herself gathering an unexpected army of allies within the household, servants who had spent years enforcing the family's demands for silence, now quietly, cautiously offering their support for something entirely different. Alice, the young maid who had once flinched at the sound of the Dowager Duchess's raised voice, suggested musicians she had heard playing at a neighboring estate, lively and bold, nothing like the quiet, forgettable tunes usually played at Ashcombe gatherings. George, the footman who had long avoided meeting anyone's eyes, offered to help arrange the guest list, quietly suggesting families the Ashcombes had distanced themselves from over the years, families whose presence might raise questions the Dowager Duchess had spent years avoiding. Alina listened to every suggestion carefully, weaving together a vision for the reception that grew bolder and more ambitious with each passing day. She would invite not only the families the Ashcombes had always associated with, but also those they had quietly excluded, the ones whose presence might invite uncomfortable questions about Charlotte, about the family's long history of enforced silence, about the truth hidden behind locked doors and careful appearances. She would fill the house with music too loud for the Dowager Duchess's taste, conversation too honest for the family's usual careful discretion, and guests whose very presence would force the truth of Charlotte's story into the open, whether the Dowager Duchess wished it or not. Sebastian watched the preparations unfold with a mixture of apprehension and something that looked, increasingly, like admiration. "You are planning something far larger than a simple reception," he observed one evening, finding Alina in the library, surrounded by lists of names and half-finished plans. "I am planning the truth, Sebastian. The reception is simply the occasion. My mother will be furious when she realizes the scope of what you intend. Your mother has spent 6 years hiding behind fury and silence. I intend to give her something worth being furious about." Sebastian studied her for a long moment, something warm and unfamiliar settling into his expression. "You are not at all what I expected when I sent that letter asking for a quiet wife." "No," Alina agreed, a small, determined smile touching her lips. "I do not imagine I am." Outside the library windows, the London sky had begun to darken with the promise of the coming season, and somewhere within the quiet, careful walls of Ravensmore Hall, a plan was taking shape that would finally break the silence this family had spent generations building around itself. Alina did not know exactly what would happen once the truth came into the open, but she knew, with growing certainty, that whatever came next would be far louder and far more honest than anything this house had witnessed in a very long time. The Dowager Duchess discovered the true scope of Alina's plans 2 weeks before the reception, and the confrontation that followed shook the entire household. It began with the guest list. Alina had kept her additions carefully hidden until the invitations were nearly ready to be sent, knowing full well that revealing them too early would give the Duchess ample time to intervene. But a careless remark from one of the footmen, overheard by the Duchess's personal maid, revealed that names long absent from Ashcombe gatherings had found their way onto the list once again. The Dowager Duchess summoned Alina to her private sitting room, a space Alina had never before been invited to enter, decorated in the same dark, heavy style as the rest of the house, though something about the room felt colder still, as though grief had settled permanently into its walls. "I am told," the Duchess said without any greeting, "that you have invited the Farringtons." "I have." "The Farringtons have not set foot in this house in over a decade. Lady Farrington was Charlotte's closest friend." "I am aware," Alina said calmly. "That is precisely why I invited her." The Duchess's composure cracked slightly, her hands tightening around the arms of her chair. "You wish to humiliate this family. You wish to drag my daughter's memory into public spectacle to satisfy your own curiosity. I wish, Alina said, to stop pretending Charlotte never existed. I wish to invite the people who loved her, who might finally speak her name in this house without fear of punishment. I do not believe that is humiliation, Your Grace. I believe it is long overdue honesty. You know nothing of what happened. You know nothing of the grief this family has carried. I know what I read in her letters, Alina said quietly. I know she felt suffocated by the silence this house demanded of her. I know she died alone under a false name because she had nowhere else to turn. And I know that silence has not protected this family's grief, Your Grace. It has simply hidden it, festering, unspoken, for 6 long years. The Dowager Duchess rose sharply from her chair, her face pale with an anger that seemed to Alina to be barely containing something far more fragile beneath it. You have no right to speak of my daughter. I have every right, Alina said, standing her ground despite the older woman's fury. I am her brother's wife. I live in the house she once called home. I sleep in rooms she once walked through, surrounded by portraits that never once include her face, because this family decided it was easier to erase her than to grieve her honestly. Get out, the Duchess said, her voice trembling. Get out of this room. Alina did not move immediately. Instead, she studied the older woman carefully, seeing beneath the fury something she had not expected to find. Raw, unhealed grief, buried so deeply beneath years of practiced control that the Duchess herself seemed unable to access it directly, expressing it only through anger, through rigid rules, through a desperate insistence on silence that had never once brought her peace. Your Grace, Alina said, softer now, I do not say these things to hurt you. I say them because I believe you have been carrying Charlotte's loss alone in silence for far too long. I believe that silence has never once helped you heal. I believe perhaps it has only made the wound deeper. The Duchess said nothing, but her hands, Alina noticed, had begun to tremble. The reception will proceed as planned, Alina continued. The Farringtons will attend. Charlotte's name will be spoken in this house again, whether it is comfortable or not. I am sorry if that causes you pain, truly. But I do not believe further silence is the answer. Alina left the room without waiting for a response, her heart pounding despite her outward composure, uncertain whether she had just made an enemy of the Dowager Duchess for good, or whether she had, perhaps, cracked open something that had needed cracking for a very long time. The preparations continued over the following days despite the tension that now hung over every corner of Ravensmore Hall. The Dowager Duchess retreated further into her private chambers, emerging rarely, speaking even less, though Alina noticed she had stopped actively opposing the reception's preparations, a small but significant shift that Alina chose to interpret cautiously as progress. The household staff, meanwhile, had thrown themselves fully into the effort, finding in the preparations a rare opportunity to voice opinions and ideas that had long been suppressed within the rigid structure of the house. Alice arranged for musicians who played bold, lively melodies, nothing like the muted, forgettable tunes typically heard at Ashcombe gatherings. George coordinated the seating arrangements with careful attention to which families might finally speak openly to one another after years of careful distance. Mrs. Whitfield oversaw the kitchen preparations with an energy Alina had not seen from her before, clearly relishing the chance to create something memorable rather than simply adequate. Sebastian, too, found himself drawn increasingly into the preparations, though his involvement carried a different weight than the enthusiasm of the staff. Late one evening, Alina found him in the East Wing, standing outside the locked door that had once housed his sister's private chambers. I have not been in this room since she left, he said quietly when Alina approached. I could not bring myself to enter it, even after we learned of her death. It felt like admitting something I was not ready to admit. Would you like to enter it now? Sebastian was quiet for a long moment before nodding slowly. He produced a key from his pocket, worn smooth from years of being carried but never used, and unlocked the door for the first time in 6 years. The room beyond was exactly as Charlotte had left it, preserved in careful, undisturbed silence. A writing desk sat near the window, papers still scattered across its surface. A small collection of books lined a shelf against the far wall. A single, unfinished piece of embroidery rested on a chair near the fireplace, as though Charlotte had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. Sebastian moved through the room slowly, his hand trailing gently across the surfaces of objects his sister had once touched every day, his composure cracking with each new discovery. He paused at the writing desk, lifting a small, unfinished letter from among the scattered papers. "She was writing to me," he said, his voice unsteady, "the night she left. She never finished it." Elinor stood quietly beside him as he read the letter, watching years of buried grief finally surface in his expression, unguarded and raw for the first time since she had known him. "I want to include this room in the reception," Sebastian said finally, setting the letter down carefully. "I want to open it properly to those who loved her. I want her memory to exist somewhere in this house that is not locked away and forgotten." "Are you certain?" "I have spent 6 years being certain of the wrong things," Sebastian said. "I would like, for once, to be certain of something that finally feels honest." Together, they began the careful work of preparing Charlotte's room to be included in the reception. A small, private space where guests who had known and loved her might finally pay their respects, openly, without the fear and silence that had governed her life and death for far too long. As the day of the reception approached, Ravensmore Hall began to transform. Flowers Elinor had chosen herself filled the halls with color and fragrance, a striking contrast to the muted, careful decor the house had maintained for years. Musicians arrived to rehearse in the grand ballroom, their bold melodies filling the once silent corridors with sound. The kitchen staff worked tirelessly under Mrs. Whitfield's energetic direction, preparing a feast far more elaborate than anything the house had hosted in recent memory. The Dowager Duchess emerged from her chambers only once during these final preparations, standing silently in the doorway of the grand ballroom, watching the transformation unfold before her with an expression Elinor could not fully read. She said nothing, offered no comment, simply observed for several long minutes before retreating once again into the privacy of her rooms. Elinor did not know what thoughts moved behind the Duchess's careful composure, whether anger, grief, or something more complicated still. But she noticed, in the days that followed, small signs that something within the older woman had begun, however reluctantly, to shift. A single vase of flowers appeared outside Charlotte's newly opened room, placed there without explanation or acknowledgement, though Elinor suspected she knew exactly whose hand had left it. The reception was 2 days away, and Ravensmore Hall, for the first time in 6 long years, was preparing not for silence, but for something far louder and far more honest than this house had known in a very long time. The night of the reception arrived with a clear, bright sky, stars scattered above Ravensmore Hall as carriages began lining the long drive, their lanterns casting warm light across hedges that had, for once, been left slightly less severe in their trimming, softened by garlands of flowers Elinor had insisted upon. Inside, the grand ballroom glowed with candlelight, the bold music Alice had arranged filling the air with a warmth the house had not known in years. Elinor stood near the entrance, dressed in a gown of deep blue, far bolder in color than the pale, forgettable shades usually favored by Ashcombe women, and watched as guests began to arrive. The Farringtons arrived early, Lady Farrington's eyes immediately searching the room with an emotion Elinor recognized as cautious hope, as though she too had wondered, for years, whether Charlotte's memory would ever be spoken of openly again. "Duchess Hartley," Lady Farrington said, taking Elinor's hands warmly, "I confess I did not expect to receive an invitation to this house again." "I am glad you came," Elinor said. "There is something I would like to show you later this evening if you are willing." Lady Farrington's expression grew curious, but she nodded, and Elinor moved on to greet the growing crowd of guests, each interaction a small step in the larger plan she had spent weeks carefully constructing. The evening unfolded with a liveliness Ravensmore Hall had not witnessed in years. Conversations grew animated rather than careful, Laughter rang out from corners of the ballroom that had known only quiet murmurs for far too long, and the music, bold and unapologetic, filled every silence the house had once demanded. Edmund Caro arrived among the later guests, his expression carrying the same predatory confidence Alina remembered from their previous encounter. He approached her directly, a thin smile on his lips. "I confess surprise at receiving an invitation, Duchess, given our last exchange. I believe in giving people opportunities to reconsider their behavior, Mr. Caro," Alina said evenly. "I hope you have used the time since our last meeting wisely." His smile faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly, moving on to needle other guests with his usual sharp remarks. Alina did not concern herself further with him. Tonight was not about Edmund Caro's opinions. Tonight was about something far more important. Sebastian found her near the edge of the ballroom as the evening reached its peak, his expression a careful mixture of nervousness and something that looked increasingly like pride. "My mother has not yet appeared," he said quietly. "She will," Alina said, with more confidence than she entirely felt. "When she is ready." As if summoned by the words themselves, the Dowager Duchess appeared at the top of the grand staircase, dressed not in her usual severe black, but in a deep, dignified gray that seemed, for her, a remarkable concession toward color. The ballroom's conversation dimmed slightly as guests noticed her presence, old habits of careful deference resurfacing even amid the evening's newfound liveliness. The Duchess descended the stairs slowly, her expression unreadable, and made her way through the crowd with the same rigid composure she had maintained for years. Alina watched her carefully, uncertain what to expect, prepared for anger, for a final confrontation that might unravel everything she had worked toward. Instead, the Duchess stopped before Lady Farrington, the two women studying each other in silence for a long moment. "Margaret," the Duchess said finally, her voice unsteady in a way Alina had never heard before, "it has been a long time." "Too long, Your Grace," Lady Farrington replied gently. "I understand you were her closest friend." "I was honored to be so." The Duchess's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for Alina to see the grief she had spent 6 years burying beneath rigid rules and careful silence. "I have something I believe you should see," she said quietly. "If you are willing to accompany me." Together, the Dowager Duchess and Lady Farrington made their way toward the East Wing, toward the room that had remained locked for 6 long years. Now opened, waiting, filled with the small, precious details of a life the family had tried so hard to erase. Alina did not follow immediately, understanding instinctively that this moment belonged to the two women, to the grief they had each carried separately for far too long. She watched them disappear down the hallway, and felt something loosen in her own chest, a tension she had not fully realized she had been carrying since her arrival at Ravensmore Hall. The reception continued around her, guests unaware of the quiet reckoning taking place in the East Wing, though word began to spread slowly through the crowd as more guests, those who had known Charlotte, made their way toward the newly opened room, drawn by whispered mentions of a name the house had not spoken aloud in years. Alina found herself approached by an older gentleman she recognized as Lord Ashford, a distant relation of the Ashcombe family who had rarely visited in recent years. "I must say, Duchess," he said, studying her with evident curiosity, "this evening is unlike any gathering this house has hosted in a very long time. There is talk, you know, that Charlotte's room has finally been opened." "There is truth to that talk, my lord." "Remarkable," he said, shaking his head slowly. "I confess, I did not think this family capable of such change. The Ashcombes have always valued their silence above all else." "Perhaps," Alina said, "silence was never truly serving them, my lord. Perhaps it was simply the habit they knew best." Lord Ashford studied her for a long moment, something like respect settling into his expression. "You are a rather unusual Duchess, if you do not mind my saying so." "I have been told that before, my lord." "I have come to consider it a compliment." As the evening wore on, Alina noticed a steady stream of guests making their way toward the East Wing, each emerging with expressions that ranged from quiet grief to something that looked, remarkably, like relief. Charlotte's name, spoken aloud after 6 years of enforced silence, seemed to be settling gently over the gathering, no longer a source of shame or fear, but simply a memory finally allowed to exist openly. It was near midnight when Sebastian found Alina again, his expression carrying an emotion she had never before seen on his face. Unguarded happiness, tempered by something quieter and more profound. "My mother is speaking with Lady Farrington about Charlotte," he said. "Truly speaking, Alina, sharing memories. I have not seen her speak of my sister so openly in 6 years. How do you feel?" Sebastian considered the question carefully before answering. "I feel as though something that has been broken in this house for a very long time has finally begun, slowly, to heal." "That is only the beginning," Alina said. "Healing does not happen in a single evening." "No," Sebastian agreed, "but perhaps it can begin with one." He offered his hand, and Alina took it, allowing him to lead her toward the center of the ballroom as the musicians began a new song, bold and warm, entirely unlike anything Ravensmore Hall had known before Alina's arrival. As they danced, surrounded by guests whose laughter and conversation filled the halls that had once known only careful, practiced silence, Alina felt something settle firmly into place within her, a certainty that the choice she had made, weeks ago, to challenge the silence this family had demanded, had been the right one. The reception would be remembered, she knew, not simply for its liveliness or its unusual guest list, but for the truth it had finally allowed to surface after 6 long years of silence. And somewhere in the East Wing, in a room that had remained locked and forgotten for far too long, a mother and her daughter's dearest friend were finally speaking, openly and honestly, about a woman the family had loved and lost, and had, for 6 long years, been too afraid to properly grieve. The loudest reception of the season, Alina thought, watching the joyful chaos unfold around her, had turned out to be exactly what this house had needed all along. The morning after the reception, Ravensmore Hall woke to an unfamiliar quiet, though it was a different kind of silence than the house had known before, softer and less strained, like the calm that follows a long-overdue storm. Alina rose early, before most of the household had stirred, and made her way toward the East Wing, drawn by a curiosity she could not quite explain. She found the Dowager Duchess already there, seated in a chair near Charlotte's writing desk, the unfinished letter Sebastian had discovered days earlier resting gently in her hands. "I did not expect to find you here," the Duchess said without looking up. "I did not expect to find myself here either," Alina admitted, stepping carefully into the room. "I can leave if you would prefer solitude." "No," the Duchess said, surprising her. "Please stay." Alina sat quietly in a chair near the window, watching as the older woman traced her fingers gently over her daughter's unfinished handwriting. "I have spent 6 years telling myself that Charlotte's death was a consequence of her own recklessness," the Duchess said finally, her voice quiet and unsteady. "I told myself she should have simply followed the rules, accepted her place, and she would still be here today. It was easier than admitting the truth." "And what is the truth, Your Grace?" The Duchess was silent for a long moment before answering. "The truth is that I built the rules that drove her away. I built a house so obsessed with silence and appearance that my own daughter felt she had nowhere to turn but toward strangers, toward a false name, toward a life alone in a village where no one knew who she truly was. The truth is that my silence killed her, not her recklessness." "Your Grace." "Please," the Duchess said, "allow an old woman to finally speak the truth she has avoided for far too long." Alina fell silent, allowing the Duchess the space to continue. "When you arrived in this house," the Duchess said, "I saw in you everything I feared in Charlotte. A woman unwilling to remain quiet, unwilling to accept the rules I had built to protect this family. I treated you with the same coldness I once used to try to control my daughter, believing, foolishly, that silence would protect you the way I told myself it should have protected her. It never protects anyone, Your Grace. It only isolates. I understand that now, the Duchess said, though I understand it far too late to help my own daughter. She looked up finally, meeting Alina's eyes directly for the first time since her arrival at Ravensmoor Hall. I do not know if I can change the habits of a lifetime, Duchess Hartley, but I would like to try, for Charlotte's memory if for nothing else. That is all any of us can ask, Your Grace, Alina said gently, a willingness to try. The weeks that followed brought slow, careful changes to Ravensmoor Hall, changes that would have seemed impossible only a month before. The Dowager Duchess began speaking of Charlotte openly, small mentions at first, growing more frequent as the family's grief finally found room to exist rather than remain buried beneath careful silence. The locked door at the end of the East Wing hallway remained open. Charlotte's room slowly transformed from a forgotten space into a quiet memorial the family visited freely, without fear or shame. The household staff, too, found their voices returning gradually, the careful, practiced silence that had governed their movements for years giving way to something more natural, more human. Alice began humming softly as she worked, a small habit she had long suppressed. George found himself meeting the eyes of the family he served, no longer flinching from simple, ordinary interaction. Mrs. Whitfield ran her kitchen with an energy and warmth Alina suspected had always existed beneath her careful, professional exterior, simply waiting for the opportunity to emerge. Sebastian changed most of all. The guarded distance he had maintained since Alina's arrival slowly softened into something warmer, more open, as though the confrontation with his mother, the reopening of his sister's room, the honest reckoning the reception had forced upon this family, had finally allowed him to release a burden he had carried silently for 6 long years. I used to believe, he told Alina one evening, as they walked together through the gardens behind Ravensmoor Hall, the same gardens that had once seemed so severe and unnatural to her, now softened by flowers she had insisted upon planting throughout the grounds. That silence was the only way to protect the people I loved. I believed if I simply followed the rules, remained careful and quiet, I could keep everyone safe. And now I believe silence protects nothing, he said. It only delays the inevitable reckoning, allows wounds to fester rather than heal. I believe, perhaps, that the only real protection comes from honesty, difficult as it may sometimes be. Alina smiled, taking his hand as they walked. I believe you are beginning to understand something it took me rather less time to learn. You always were the wiser one in this arrangement, Sebastian said, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. Though I confess, when I sent that letter asking for a quiet wife, I never imagined the woman who would answer it would end up teaching this entire family how to finally speak. I did warn you, Your Grace, Alina said, that I did not know if I could remain silent forever. You did indeed, Sebastian agreed. I am rather glad now that you were right. As the London season continued, word of the Ashcombe family's remarkable reception spread throughout society, and rather than the scandal the Dowager Duchess had once feared, the family found itself regarded with a new kind of respect. Other families, long weary of the rigid, careful performances demanded by social propriety, began to speak more openly of their own struggles, their own losses, inspired by the honesty Alina had brought into a house that had spent generations avoiding it. Lady Farrington became a frequent visitor to Ravensmoor Hall, her friendship with the Dowager Duchess slowly rebuilding itself around shared memories of Charlotte, memories that no longer needed to remain hidden behind locked doors and careful silence. Alina, for her part, settled fully into her role as Duchess of Ashcombe, though it looked nothing like the quiet, invisible position she had once been asked to accept. She spoke freely at gatherings, offered her opinions without fear of punishment, and slowly began to reshape the household's rigid traditions into something warmer, more honest, more alive. On a quiet afternoon, nearly a year after her arrival at Ravensmoor Hall, Alina found herself standing once again before the portrait gallery that lined the main hallway, the same gallery whose painted eyes had once seemed to judge her silently upon her arrival. A new portrait had been added recently, commissioned by Sebastian himself, a painting of Charlotte, finally restored to her rightful place among her family's history, no longer erased or forgotten. Beside it, a space remained for a portrait of Alina herself, still unfinished, the artist having only recently begun his work. "What do you think it should show?" Sebastian asked, coming to stand beside her. Alina considered the question carefully, studying the long line of portraits stretching down the hallway. Generations of Ashcombe women who had, for far too long, been asked to fade quietly into the background of their own family's history. "I think," she said finally, "it should show a woman who is finally allowed to be seen." Sebastian smiled, taking her hand gently in his. "I believe that can be arranged, Duchess Hartley." Outside the tall windows of Ravensmore Hall, the London season continued its lively rhythm, and within the walls that had once demanded only silence, laughter and honest conversation had finally found a permanent home. Alina Hartley, once asked to disappear quietly into a role designed to erase her, had instead become the very thing that finally taught an entire family how to speak. And in the process, she had given a woman long silenced by death the thing her family had denied her in life: the chance at last to be remembered honestly, openly, and without shame. 2 years after the reception that changed Ravensmore Hall forever, Alina stood once again in the grand ballroom, watching preparations unfold for what had become an annual tradition, a gathering held each year on the anniversary of that first, transformative evening. The house looked nothing like the cold, silent fortress she had first entered as a nervous young bride. Flowers filled every hallway now, a habit Alina had never abandoned. Music drifted freely through rooms that had once known only careful, muted conversation. Portraits of Ashcombe women, Charlotte among them, lined the gallery with pride rather than shame, their stories finally honored rather than hidden. The Dowager Duchess, though still reserved in her manner, had softened considerably over the years, finding a quiet joy in her grandchildren. The two young sons Alina and Sebastian had welcomed into the family, neither of whom would ever know the suffocating silence that had once governed this house. She spoke of Charlotte often now, sharing memories with anyone willing to listen, finally allowing her grief the space it had always deserved. Mrs. Whitfield ran the household with an ease and warmth that had transformed the staff's relationship with the family entirely. Alice had married George within the first year following the reception, their quiet courtship finally given room to bloom in a household no longer governed by fear and enforced silence. Lord Ashford had become a regular guest, often remarking, with evident amusement, that the Ashcombe family he now knew bore little resemblance to the rigid, distant house he remembered from years past. Lady Farrington's friendship with the Dowager Duchess had deepened into something resembling sisterhood. The two women often found together in the garden, tending to a small memorial rose bed planted in Charlotte's honor, its blooms a vivid, living tribute to a woman whose memory had finally found peace. Sebastian had changed most remarkably of all. The guarded, distant duke who had once demanded silence from his future wife had become a man known throughout London society for his warmth, his honesty, and his willingness to challenge the rigid traditions that had once defined his family. He often told the story of his marriage's unusual beginning to friends and acquaintances, always ending with the same observation. "I asked for a quiet wife," he would say, a fond smile touching his lips, "and instead I received the greatest gift of my life." Alina, watching the preparations for another joyful gathering unfold around her, thought often of the frightened young woman who had first arrived at Ravensmore Hall, uncertain of her place, warned repeatedly to remain silent and unseen. She thought of Charlotte's letters, hidden behind a library shelf, and the courage it had taken to finally bring their truth into the light. She thought of every servant who had once flinched at the sound of a raised voice, now free to speak, to laugh, to exist fully within these walls without fear. The silence that had once defined this house was gone, replaced by something far richer, far more honest, and far more alive. As guests began arriving for the evening celebration, their laughter and conversation filling the halls with warmth, Alina felt Sebastian's hand find hers, steady and sure, exactly as it had been every day since that first difficult winter. "Ready for another loud evening, Duchess Hartley?" he asked, a familiar teasing warmth in his voice. Elinor smiled, looking out over the transformed ballroom, the flowers, the music, the joyful chaos that had become the true legacy of her marriage. "I have been ready," she said, "since the very first day I refused to be quiet." And as the music began, filling every corner of a house that had once known only silence, Elinor Hartley, Duchess of Ashcombe, stepped forward to greet her guests, no longer the frightened bride who had once feared disappearing into the shadows of her own life, but a woman who had, through courage and honesty, finally taught an entire family how to live and love out loud.